so sure you're right about this, Jules, who is already suggesting that every pause in these terrible, catastrophic interviews. Do you see what I did there? Catastrophic. No? Oh, I don't know why I bother. I was up all night working on that. Is designed to string out the time, because each interview was so short. The longer she paused, the fewer questions she would need to answer. I disagree on this occasion, Jules. I think that some of them do that, but you could almost hear the cogs whirring at a snail's pace as she desperately sought to come up with something to say in response to some rather splendid questions from a selection of local radio presenters on the BBC. Part of the reason, if you're wondering, why would she do that and not do national stuff? Cowardice, I guess, although a huge miscalculation from her comms department, where, I kid you not, someone who, until quite recently, worked for Prince Andrew, is currently quite high on the ladder of seniority. They don't have to worry about access. These people, if they get to speak to the Prime Minister about once every electoral cycle, maybe during when there's an election on the horizon, and it's all set up in advance, and there's no chance whatsoever of a presenter on BBC Bristol or on BBC Kent having access pulled. Oh no, we won't talk to them next time, because it's done so swiftly, and for such a short period of time, that they don't have to do what many presenters and journalists at a national level have to do, which is, sadly, and I mean no criticism by this, because I fully appreciate that not everybody can put together a daily current affairs programme without ever talking to a member of the government, but they have to prostrate themselves a bit. They have to pull their punches. Not completely, not always consciously. Sometimes it's subconscious. But, that is why sometimes the local radio journalists, who don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to be, invited to actually present a Conservative leadership hustings, for example. They don't have to worry about keeping these people sweet, so they can actually hit them with questions that might land a little harder than we are currently used to. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. We'll have a little listen to some of them at the moment, but let's begin with a quick roundup. If only you'd taken that job at Radio Norfolk, says Paul. Yeah, I know. Every day I wake up wondering. It's a sliding doors moment for me on that. 6 minutes after 10 is the time. I mean, here's the mad thing, right, about this morning. I mean, it's madness upon madness upon madness. But the mad thing about this morning is that unless I misconstrued everything I've heard so far, then you're looking at Liz Truss speaking publicly, making an appalling situation worse. Because as she was actually speaking, the UK's 10-year gilt rose by about 21 basis points to 4.22%, which means she has undone, and I know why this has happened, by refusing to admit a mistake and by continuing to claim that everything is going according to plan and this was actually the right thing to do. There's a huge flaw in that claim, by the way, which we'll get to in a second. But by refusing to admit any form of mistake and continuing to claim that everything that they've done was the right thing to do, she spooks the markets further. So this is where things get truly surreal, and that's an overused word, but it fits today because the distance from rational reality and this government now is so enormous that you could drive the Titanic through it, and the Titanic, of course, remains a very relevant analogy, because what the Bank of England did yesterday was essentially slam on the emergency brakes on the government. The announcement by Kwasi Kwarteng last week had done such damage to the markets, if you like, or rather to our economic standing, that the Bank of England had to use a ton of money to buy up stuff that, if they hadn't bought it, could have seen a run upon your pension fund, of the kind seen with the Northern Rock not that long ago. So that's what happened yesterday. It's a very simple relationship. Whatever your politics, whatever your religion, whatever football team you support, the markets, the money markets, which determine, most importantly, how much it costs to borrow money, for example. That is the single most important element of this, especially for a government that has just announced billions and billions and billions and billions of pounds of uncosted borrowing. The amount you will have to pay to borrow money is one of the main things affected by the quotes markets, end quotes, okay? They have run for the hills after Kwasi Kwarteng's budget announcement. So damaging is that to the overall economic picture of the nation that the Bank of England, which thank God is independent, has to gallop in and put the brakes on our own government. So the National Bank, if you like, putting the brakes on the national government. And then today the Prime Minister came out and, she did. She essentially doubled down on the policy that has both spooked the markets and compelled the central bank to directly seek to undo some of the damage done by a government policy. So the bank is seeking to undo damage done by a policy introduced by Liz Truss, which she this morning is not only defending, but claiming was the correct course of action to follow. And that, in all the years I have been doing this job, is possibly the hardest thing I have ever tried to understand, or the most difficulty I have ever had in understanding why they are doing something. Until you think of that big boat that we mentioned a moment ago. And they can't let go of the life raft. The life raft at the moment is the claim. It's a very Brexity claim. The life raft is the claim that however bad everything is going, it's definitely the right thing to be doing. Cling, 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 fingertips. Let go of it, what happens? You're out, you're finished, you're toast. And now this attempt in some corners of the media to separate Kwarteng from Truss. Man alive, that's pathetic. You remember the three-legged race on Sports Day at school? Do you remember that, when they used to bind our ankles together? And I don't know if they're allowed to do it anymore. It's probably so many fractured ankles and broken out. I'm sure they are. That's Truss and Kwarteng. They're bound at the ankle. Absolutely no way that he went out on Friday and announced things that she wasn't four square behind. Just doesn't happen like that. It simply doesn't. So that's where we are now. And this morning, as she spoke, even if you, like me, struggle to understand some of the technical stuff, let me put it in the simplest of language. As Liz Truss was speaking, some of the damage undone by the Bank of England yesterday was redone. And here's another thing I noticed. Oh, quickly, the reason why the defence that this is absolutely fine and all going according to plan is so dishonest and destructive and ridiculous is very, very simply because they would have told us. If they'd known that this was going to happen, they'd have told us this was going to happen. The sort of phalanx of complete flumps who have been praising this. Only one or two of them are left. There's a bloke in the Telegraph called Alistair Heath still claiming he was claiming it's the best budget he'd ever seen last week. Front page of the Daily Telegraph, finally a proper Conservative budget. Do you know where the economy is today in the Daily Mail? Front page of the Daily Mail, had that headline. Less than a week later, they don't even talk about it until page 8. They've got a story on their front page, the Daily Mail, which told you Liz Truss was the answer to the nation's problems, and that budget announced last week was delivered direct from the heavens. They've got a story about one of Stephen Lawrence's murderers being found with a phone up his fundament. That's the front page story of the Conservative Party's House Journal today, the Daily Mail, while the country burns. That's what they're doing. Look over there, page 8, before they even get round to it. And, of course, if there was even a scintilla of truth, if there was a morsel of plausibility in the claim that this is actually the correct thing to do and everything is going according to plan, they'd have told us. They'd have warned us. They would have comforted the markets about what the master plan was. But they're not. They are headless chickens running around claiming to be in complete control of the situation. And I have finally realised why I fell in love with a phrase a year or so ago and turned it into one of my regular catchphrases on the programme. That's not an opinion, that's counting. Because you can gaslight voters, you can gaslight media, you can sign up secretly funded lobby groups masquerading as think tanks to infiltrate every corner of the British media, selling your vampiric neoliberal agenda. That's all opinion. Opinion, opinion, opinion. You can't gaslight numbers. You can't sway the markets with propaganda. These are the super brains. These are the blokes sitting there crunching numbers and reading the runes and looking at what's going to happen on the horizon and betting the house on it. They take a lot more care with their decisions than Kwasi Kwarteng or Liz Truss do. Kwasi Kwarteng dispensing with the most senior civil servant in the Treasury, a universally respected individual called Tom Scholar, and simultaneously telling the Independent Office for Budgetary Responsibility not to bother getting out of bed in the morning when they were ready and willing to provide proper economic costings and forecasts of everything that he announced on Friday. It is literally closing your eyes and sticking your fingers in your ears. And I mean literally, it's not metaphorical. At some point, he must have actually closed his eyes and stuck his fingers in his ears. Everybody needs... I didn't nearly use a rude word there. I should stop saying that. I'm far too professional ever to use a rude word on the radio, but I'd like to sometimes. everybody needs a WASIC alarm, right? Everybody needs a WASIC alarm. Everybody needs someone who will whisper in their ear on occasion, mate, you're being a WASIC. I'm very lucky. I've told you before. I'll tell you again. I made the very brilliant decision of marrying a WASIC alarm. A few things more important to a happy marriage than having a WASIC alarm on the other side of the dining table. Whoa, wind your neck out. And he got rid of his WASIC alarm. Not only did he get rid of his WASIC alarm, he also got rid of his spreadsheet. And he just walked into the House of Commons and announced stuff without justifying it, explaining it, accounting for it, or generating any faith whatsoever in it, outside, of course, the offices of the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. And that's why we are where we are. There it is, in a nutshell. Except there's one massive thing missing, isn't there? What the hell are they playing at? That's the only thing that's missing. What the hell are they playing at? And that, I think, is as good a question to kick things off this morning as any other. 0345 6060 973. My apologies to the brilliant journalists working in local radio across the BBC who've been interviewing Liz Truss this morning very, very effectively, because I was planning on playing those clips out in the first bit of the programme. But as often happens at times like this, I find myself rather carried away by events. So we'll get onto that shortly. And then, or even before, what is actually happening? What did they think they were playing at? I think that's an important question to ask. What did they actually think they were playing at? Because they wouldn't tell us the plan. They wouldn't even allow in the room the people who've been doing this for years and might have been able to give them a steer in one direction or the other. They got rid of the biggest professional in the Treasury, whose job is to follow orders, remember, even as he points out some flaws in those orders. So that combination there across the last week of announcing something so appalling, so obviously appalling, watching the carnage that it has wreaked upon our economy, seeing the central bank step in to try to undo some of that carnage. 24 hours later, the Prime Minister appears on broadcast interviews actually reimposing some of that damage, resurrecting some of that damage, undoing some of the work that the Bank of England has done to assuage the situation by claiming that everything's going according to plan. So what do they think they are playing at? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. What do they think they are playing at? Not what do you think they're playing at? Although, actually, we'd probably let that one in as well. But what do they think? What do they think they were playing at? It doesn't get worse than this. I have actually paused. I haven't just carried on talking throughout that entire junction, and then Keith's just turned the dial back up and I'm picking up where I left off. You know, when we play the fade out, when we very occasionally pulled a nuclear weapon of radio phone-ins out of the arsenal and fade out someone who's ranting interminably about Brexit or, I don't know, whatever the issue of the day may be. You always want to find out, if you turned it back up again 3 minutes later, would they still be there? Going, people like you are the reason why this country is called... I don't know, but I promise you I did pause and have a drink of tea and have a look around the studio, a bit of a stretch, all that kind of thing. I haven't just been talking into the ether while the lights were off and now they are back on. But it doesn't really get any worse than this, I don't believe, because you have reality on one hand, a cold, hard, observable reality, and you have the government on the other hand. I mean, it's lazy to reach for North Korean parallels and things like that, but never before. I mean, it almost makes it look like entry-level lying, doesn't it, to claim that Boris Johnson got all the big calls right when he categorically didn't. But this is different because I think it's so immediate. I think you're looking at what's happening to the markets and you're listening to the government speak at the same time. That they weren't claiming that Boris Johnson had got all the big calls right when we actually had one of the highest death tolls in the world, or when it was obvious that our lockdowns had come late, or when our death homes were turned into plague pits, our care homes were turned into plague pits, care homes, death homes, crikey. It's a Freudian slip, isn't it? No one was claiming it then. They let the water flow through the town for a while before they started claiming that Boris Johnson had got all the big calls right. But this lot are denying reality even as it bites them on the backside, even as it unfolds in front of them. Here's an example from BBC Stoke this morning when a presenter called John Akers asked the Prime Minister about, I think we've got a longer version of this now. We've got a 1-minute version of the interview on BBC Stoke. No? Have we not got that? Okay. We'll try and get the 1-minute version of the interview from BBC Stoke ready for you, because when the Prime Minister was asked about mortgages that I felt perhaps the Prime Minister was at her weakest. OK, we'll take the 35-second version then.
It's also about how we grow the size of the pie so that everyone can benefit.
By borrowing more and putting our mortgages up.
We need to borrow more this winter for the energy crisis that we're facing. And I think that was the right thing to do.
We're going to spend more in mortgage fees under what you've done based on the predictions than we would have saved with energy.
I don't think anybody is arguing that we shouldn't have acted on energy.
We're going to be doing this a lot today, aren't we? Let's have another listen to that and just focus on it. It was the one I wanted. My misreading my own notes on the clip length here, but I've got 5 clips. I'll probably have more by the end of the programme. It's just gentle questioning. It's none of the tub thumping or the desk slapping that some of us like to engage in. It's just there. It's all there. And she hasn't got a clue. I suppose I'm going to have another question added to the list today. We've got Mystery Hour at 12, so I imagine we'll be sticking with this all the way up until then. Is how did it come to this? What did they think was going to happen? And how did it come to this? Just have a listen here to the person that last week the Daily Mail were telling you was the answer to all the country's problems and the answer to your prayers. Last week, the right-wing media and the secretly funded think tanks were queuing up to claim that she was the absolute messiah. And here she is today.
It's also about how we grow the size of the pie so that everyone can benefit.
By borrowing more and putting our mortgages up.
We need to borrow more this winter for the energy crisis that we're facing. And I think that was the right thing to do.
We're going to spend more in mortgage fees under what you've done based on the predictions than we would have saved with energy.
I don't think anybody is arguing that we shouldn't have acted on energy.
I have to keep a very close ear on those silences. So does Keith, because if they reach a certain length, our emergency tape kicks in. Here is Anna Cookson, formerly of this parish, on BBC Kent.
Carrie in Birchington says, what on earth were you thinking? The country was already in a state of recession. Another says, how can we ever trust the Conservatives with our economy again? And Lydia says, are you ashamed of what you've done? Are you?
I think we have to remember what situation this country was facing. We were going into the winter with people expected to face fuel bills of up to £6,000, huge rates of inflation.
And you've made it worse.
But also slowing economic growth. And what we've done is we've taken action to make sure that from this weekend, people won't be paying a typical fuel bill of more than £2,500, not just this year, but also next year.
But isn't that cancelled out by the fact that you're making inflation work with the measures that you have brought in on Friday in the mini budget? People are worried about their mortgages and they're tearing their hair out over their pensions. I've got so many messages, Liz.
This will curb inflation by up to 5%.
When?
When? And of course, the forecast yesterday from, I think, Moody's, one of the credit agencies, that this is actually going to damage economic growth. It's actually going to put economic growth into reverse. So Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss make a series of announcements designed to stimulate economic growth, and the markets say it's going to have the opposite effect. That's not an opinion, you see, that's counting. I like this lad on BBC Bristol. God, I'm getting old. How dare I call him a lad? He's a young fellow professional, but he's very fresh-faced. This is someone called James Hansen.
From this weekend, the energy bill price guarantee comes in, so people will be facing no more than £2,500 for a typical energy bill. We've also taken action to reduce our tax burden and spur.
Yeah, but Prime Minister, with respect, that is the same scripted answer you've given to every BBC local radio station this morning.
Good work. And let's have a little listen to what happened when she was asked about fracking in Lancashire by Graham Liver.
Let's talk about local consent right now. What does that look like? Scott Benton, the Conservative MP for Blackpool South, in a tweet says he believes that people in Blackpool South do not support fracking. This is the Tory MP for Fylde, Mark Menzies, in the House of Commons.
If the Prime Minister is to remain a woman of her word, a woman that we can believe in, which I believe she is, can the Secretary of State outline how that local consent will be given and demonstrated in my constituency of Fylde?
What does local consent look like, Prime Minister?
Well, the Energy Secretary will be laying out in more detail exactly what that looks like, but it does mean making sure there is local support for going ahead. And I can assure
it sounds like you don't know.
And I can assure Mark Menzies, well, there are various detailed issues to be worked through, but I can assure Mark Menzies that I will make sure there is local consent if we are to go ahead in any particular area with fracking.
But your local MPs don't want it, all Conservative. In the past, the County Council have said they didn't want it, yet your government overturned it. The science hasn't changed. Why can't you tell us this morning there won't be a return to fracking in Lancashire?
Well, I don't accept the premise of your question.
Why?
It's certainly the case at present. Well, because what I've said is if there is local consent, we will go ahead. We need to explore where there is local consent and where there isn't, and we're still doing that work.
Your
I don't think we should rule out the whole of Lancashire.
You talked about how it's a success in other countries, but in America they do it in the middle of nowhere. Do you actually know where Preston New Road is, where they have been fracking?
Well, I don't think I've been to that site in the past.
Shouldn't you?
Well, as I've said, we will only go ahead with projects where there is local consent. I'm very, very clear about that.
That was the closest, was it, Keith, you think, to the emergency tape? That little bit at the bit. Just play it again and we'll come out quite early. The little bit right at the beginning where you actually, if she doesn't make these weird noises like blip, blip, there's a very real chance you'd have heard Steve Allen's voice kicking in, talking about, I don't know, Katie Price's latest travails or something.
Let's talk about local consent right now.
Here we go.
What does that look like? Scott Benton, the Conservative MP for Blackpool South, in a tweet says he believes that people in Blackpool South do not support fracking. This is the Tory MP for Fylde, Mark Menzies, in the House of Commons.
If the Prime Minister is to remain a woman of her word, a woman that we can believe in, which I believe she is, can the Secretary of State outline how that local consent will be given and demonstrated in my constituency of Fylde?
What does local consent look like, Prime Minister?
Here it is.
Well, the Energy Secretary will be
And
laying
finally,
out.
BBC Leeds, where Rima Ahmed asked about the economy.
Joining me now is the Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Good morning, Prime Minister.
Good morning.
How are you? How are you doing? Have you slept well?
I have, thank you very much.
Good.
And it's great to be here on Radio Leeds.
I am really glad that you are here as well, because since Friday, since your Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng's mini-budget, the pound has dropped to a record low. The IMF has said that you should reevaluate your policies, and the Bank of England has had to spend £65 billion to prop up the markets because of what they describe as a material risk. Where have you been?
Where have you been? And of course, the irony there is that by coming out of hiding, she has made everything worse. Do keep them coming. If you think I've missed any choice morsels of Liz Truss's public humiliations this morning on various BBC radio channels, then we'd love to play them out as well. We may play out some more of the ones that we have already played out, but a final shout for now to my broadcasting colleagues on BBC Lancashire, Leeds, Stoke, Kent and Bristol, respectively, Graham Liver, Rima Ahmed, John Akers, Anna Cookson and James Hanson. There's some really top quality work there, which was a pleasure to listen to. Until, of course, you remember that you're actually living in the skip fire that was being described. And to add to that sense of peril, I can tell you that she apparently doesn't even understand the energy price cap that is one of her own government's major policies, because on at least one occasion during that broadcast round, she claimed that no family would pay more than £2,500, which means, like an awful lot of people, she thinks it's a cap on the bill rather than a cap upon the unit cost. So lots of people will be paying more than £2,500 and lots of people will be paying less than that, because guess what, children? £2,500 is the average that will be paid after the cap has been put on the individual unit costs. So, I mean, perhaps even more concerning than the abject failure to address or answer any of the problems that she's created is the evidence there that she either slept too well and is still a little bit befuddled this morning, or genuinely doesn't understand one of the only policies that could even be remotely described as good for the country. 10:36 is the time. I think I should take some calls, don't you? Yeah. Bill's in Liverpool. Bill, what's going on?
Thanks for taking the call, James.
You're very welcome.
First-time caller, long-time listener.
Thank you, Bill.
My pleasure. It's just a shame about the circumstances, really.
Yes.
I call this the charge of the Trust Brigade because it's exactly the same as that, where we're being led by these supposed leaders who've gathered information but don't have a clue.
Yes.
It's a bit like Halloween coming early. It's very scary. We're dealing with blind economics. It's like somebody's in charge who's failed GCE.
I, much as I'm enjoying your poetic retrospective, I do want to push you towards the question of what did they think they were playing at? Because they didn't think they were going to be launching the political equivalent of one of the most ill-fated military expeditions in history, did they? They can't possibly have thought that half a league onward, all in the valley of death was going to be the flavour that was created by their policy. So what did they think they were playing at?
But the problem was those generals were actually blind. I think these are blind. They're blinded by the political dogma, by Tufnell Street and the world in which they live. They're blind to all the common sense. In fact, they've closed the doors to common sense by not having the OBR forecast. And all they've done, or all they are doing, is driving on.
You are, you are allowed to say, I don't know, James. You're allowed to say, I haven't got a Scooby, but I am going to have to ask you again, what did they think they were playing at? And I mean, I'm not criticising you because it's a figure of speech as old as the language itself, but we're talking about a metaphorical inability to see what is right in front of them. But you can see, what did they think they were playing at? That's the key question today. It's the only thing we've got to cling to.
Well, the worst thing they thought they were doing is this trickle-down economics.
Yes.
In fact, it's clear that will not and cannot work because they gave the money to the richest and to boost the financial sector,
yes,
which they thought was going to triple all the money down. But the financial sector has already turned on them and said they're wrong.
That's it, isn't it? That's the so here it is. This is what will happen. And the financial sector, as you say, to whom they gave nothing but good news on Friday, they showered them with even more money than they have already. They removed the cap on the bonuses that they can earn because you know and I know, Bill, that 200% of the annual salary is just chicken feed. It's nowhere near enough for these great masters of the universe presiding over the money markets. And then the money markets turned around and said, this is so absolutely appalling. Well, and the pound responded by hitting the lowest level it's ever hit before in its life. So then we moved to the second question. Why are they still sticking with it?
Blindness.
That's your lot. Thank you, Bill. 10:39. Chris is in Ormskirk. Not too far from Liverpool. Chris, what would you like to say?
Hi, thanks for having me on. First time I've done this, but I feel so angry. Like you do, I agree with everything you say. We really are led by donkeys, and they don't care what they do to us. They really do not care. It's all to please the ERG and the right-wingers. They want to shrink the state. They don't care if we're left with nothing. And what do we do to get them out? We need a vote of no confidence, but we can't get it at the minute.
What?
So, I'm so angry.
I can tell you, I know, and it is anger. I think that you have to guard against being angry all the time because it takes a huge toll on your mental health, but you have to absolutely get angry when only anger will do. And it you know, even if you weren't angry at the weekend, the fact that they're now doubling down, she's poked her head above the parapet for pretty much the first time since this was announced and essentially insisted that everything's going swimmingly and that this was all necessary and quite correct. I mean, I'm a fan of the homage to the ERG and the small state vampires and all the usual suspects, but it only works so far. They were not expecting this to happen. They were not expecting this to happen. One of the IEA Herberts was saying, "Oh, the markets won't mind it at all. You know, even if we do make enormous borrowings." The way I distill it down, Chris, is through those interminable hustings where Rishi Sunak said repeatedly that you can't borrow your way out of inflation. He described it as a fairy tale. I mean, he was criticised for seeming a bit superior and a bit supercilious. Looking back, I think there was genuine and sincere incredulity in his tone about what he was having to deal with on that stage with this woman. I think he was genuinely going, I can't, but I mean, he got a little taste of what it was like to be a Remainer during the Brexit debate, when the person on the other side of the debate is saying things that the audience are loving, but which you know are complete codswallop. But no one was calling out the codswallop. So that's the bit I don't get. Yeah. Now that it's all gone so horribly wrong, why are we still here? Why are we still on the same road?
I don't know. I really don't know.
It's crazy.
It's really gone pear-shaped since, well, before Brexit. And then Cummings. I mean, who elected him? Nobody. They just get away with murder, and it keeps happening. And they come on the telly and they just lie and lie and lie. And there must be a way out. There must. And these idiots must be out for generations, because they've ruined our kids' lives. You know, I don't want to talk about Brexit because people say it's done, it's over, but they've ruined our kids' lives. You know, single market, Erasmus, opportunities to work abroad. We're left with nothing, and still they get away with it. And then Cameron started all the rubbish. He walks off into the sunset. He's still got his millions, and every one of them is the same. Johnson, I can't imagine that he'll get anything will happen about all the terrible things he did, all the lies he told.
They're worried about that, actually. The Forelock Tuggers and the Cap Doffers are desperately worried that Johnson is actually going to get his fingers.
Do you think? I really hope he does. I really hope he does. You know, the number of deaths we had from COVID because of wrong decisions, it just beggars belief, and I just worn out, really. Like millions of people are. We need them out ASAP.
You've had that bubbling up for a while, haven't you, Chris?
Do you know what? I shout at sometimes I can't watch the news anymore. I really can't.
I put Chris Moyles on this morning on Radio X. There was a lovely lady in Dewsbury who won tickets for Arctic Monkeys. It was one of the loveliest things I've heard on the radio in years. I couldn't face any more news this morning.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. I mean, life is good, don't get me wrong.
Exactly.
But it's always those at the bottom that get, what can I say? Right. Those at the top are laughing. They get away with everything. Mortgage increases won't affect them.
Oh, they will, actually. I mean, not the very, very top, but there's going to be an awful lot of people living in very big houses who are absolutely worried about losing it, just as much as people in much smaller houses are worried about losing theirs. And we can almost process it if you can chalk it all up as greed, or you can see where the dots join, or you can see the, you know, the lines in the... But this is just so awful. It's the city. It's the city that's turned on them. When they start trying to claim that the bankers and the plutocrats that they just serviced effectively on Friday, they're somehow to blame for the reaction to it. We're beyond silly now. We're in new.
They just lie.
Yes.
They just lie. That's it. They just lie. And yeah, we need change. We need big change. I hate to use the R word, but we need big change.
What's the R word? Revolution.
Yeah.
Sorry, you didn't want to use it. I was just worried to talk. You're talking about a revolution. There you go. Thank you, Chris. And I hope you enjoyed that. Did you enjoy that? Because it was your debut. You sounded a little surprised at the beginning to find yourself on national radio.
Really surprised, because I often think I'll never get through. Oh, I won't even try. But hey ho, I did.
There's a lesson for everybody there. Cometh the hour, cometh the Chris. 11:15 is the time, and if you don't get through at first, then just hit redial. Like 2 or 3 minutes later, it works during the other 14 hours of the week as effectively as it can work during Miss Jan. Touching a lot of nerves there, Chris. Speaking for an awful lot of people when you speak of the exhaustion, just sense of fatigue or being overwhelmed by it. Steve Bannon talked about this. He called it flooding the zone, I think, so that there's so much awfulness going on that you can't really focus on any of it. But that was a deliberate ploy that Donald Trump, I think, arguably effected rather well. This is not a deliberate ploy. They were not expecting this to happen, which is why Chris is quite right to use the word lie to describe their claims that everything's going according to plan. If everything was going according to plan, why didn't they tell us this was the plan? What did they think they were playing at? They certainly didn't expect this to happen, so why has it all gone so wrong? And then perhaps as we head to the second hour of the programme, we might nudge towards the future. What happens next? How does this play out? How does this unfold? 0345 6060 973. Jake's in Manchester. Jake, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Nice to be on. First time caller, so I'm a bit nervous.
Everyone's saying that this morning. It's like an echo. Oh, don't be. It's only me. It's only me. What do you want to say, mate?
Only you in the nation. So, first thing is that I think that they were just relying on the IEA that they'd obviously been consulting during the leadership campaign, and they just thought that they had worked out all the numbers for them, and they just took their word as gospel and blindly trusted them, and clearly thought that anyone in civil service who was saying no to this was just pulling a Mon-Fri Appleby and trying to stall them.
I think you're probably right, aren't you? Actually, they're just the simple idea that they've swallowed the Kool-Aid so completely, and I think the man who runs the institute, the so-called Institute of Economic Affairs, has said that Liz Truss has appeared at their events more than any other politician ever. So there's no conspiracy theory here. It's not just the civil servants, of course, that they elected to ignore. They also ignored the banks, the Bank of England, the IMF, and now the credit rating agencies. So that's the bit that I struggle to fully grasp. How could they put so much faith in a few crackpots and Herberts while completely ignoring people who've dedicated their entire lives to working with the numbers rather than the opinions?
I think for economic gain, personally, but that's just my opinion. I can't say
economic gain for whoever it is that funds these outfits.
Not
for anybody else.
I do also have a proposal for how she can grow the pie and how things should go. Looking forward, if you'll indulge me.
Yeah, of course I will.
Yeah. So currently, the National Grid has got a innovation project going on to expand and upgrade the distribution network, because one of the problems is with renewable energy is that they are having trouble actually distributing. The Orkney Islands, which has a power connector to the Scottish mainland, which used to be receiving power, is now so overloaded with transmitted power from all the renewable energy that they're having to shut down the wind turbines.
Gosh.
Because they're just generating too much electricity.
Yeah, no, I understand.
So what they should be doing is they should be implementing a windfall tax specifically to fund in that National Grid project to expand the distribution network and for things like the European supergrid in order to create a viable international energy market. And what they can do to incentivise the energy generators is to go for this tax is to say, look, we're going to channel these funds into this green renewable generation, stuff like that. And any green renewables generation you install after 2023, you can have a reduced tax or even no tax at all as an incentive.
When did you think this one up?
Well, I work in the energy
I thought
industry.
you might. I mean, and that, of course, there's something quite clever about the simple relationship between a windfall tax and targeted spending. You say we're taking the money and we're using it for this. It doesn't go into that amorphous pot of public cash from which it's impossible to, separate. Sources. You literally say we're taxing you to make the energy distribution system. You should sort of think they should really be paying for themselves, but they haven't. They've given it to shareholders instead. So we'll stick a windfall tax on that, and the government will pay for the infrastructure improvements that the industry needs, that the people need, that the population needs. What did you think of Keir Starmer's big green pronouncement on Tuesday?
Unfortunately, I didn't miss that.
But the idea of having a big green energy company that's actually nationalised, it's not a million miles away from what you're suggesting.
No, it's not. I think having a something like that could possibly work. I mean, I don't know too much about it.
But you've put all your effort.
The applications of energy generation rather than like the finances.
You've put all your efforts into coming up with that rather splendid scheme, which I shall remember that. And I didn't know. I mean, the idea that it's producing too much energy, it's almost like the bath is overflowing, right? I've understood you correctly, Jake. It's like the bath is overflowing and we should have a system in place to funnel off some of that water, where obviously water is the energy and the bath is the Orkney Islands.
Yeah. Like the Orkney Islands is one example. I mean, GE have just installed some massive new wind turbines. These are like some of the best-in-class huge ones off the coast of Scotland.
Right.
Because they're already existing projects. They could just funnel this money from a windfall tax on the energy generation from the currently generating all these profits for the energy companies and funneling into already existing projects to accelerate the timeline.
I understand. Yeah, I was just checking with the bathtub analogy that I'd understood the first bit, but the second bit of it, of course, is linked to the fact that not that long ago, certainly when I was alive, the amount of money that companies would reinvest into infrastructure and investment and research and development absolutely dwarfs the amount of money that they do so now. Just look at the water companies. Don't even look at energy. Look at water for evidence of what happens when you just suck as much as cash as you can out of a company instead of spending those profits on improving the service or improving the infrastructure or keeping shocking amounts of sewage out of our waterways. Jake, what a debut. In fact, every caller today every caller is a first-time caller. 10:55 is the time. Phil's in Grimsby. Phil, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. Yeah, thanks for speaking to us. Yeah, well, I was going to...
I always think people should say that at the end of the conversation because they might not feel it by the time we get to goodbye. But I'm grateful for the sentiments. What did you want to say?
Well, I was going to try and answer your question as to what did they think they were doing.
Yes,
it's a pretty tough one, to be fair, but
isn't it?
I mean, they knew what they were doing. They've only ever done one thing, and that's look after the rich.
Yes.
They thought they were going to get away with it, the same way they've got away with everything else over the last few years. Everything else, the things that I've made a little list.
Go on.
PPE contracts.
Yeah.
Unlawful proroguing of Parliament, the lobbying scandal, the lockdown parties, Brexit. I mean, it's unbelievable that they could survive through all those things. They just thought they could get away with the next thing.
Oh, you missed out Owen Paterson and, of course, the attempts now to get Boris Johnson off a hook of his own making because they don't like the idea of having to face the consequences of their own actions. But there's something's gone wrong there because those are quite easy lies. They're quite, if you see what I mean, you and I can see the truth. They thought this would go well on Friday, and it hasn't. They did not think it would cause the pound to hit the lowest level in history. They did not think it would cause the Bank of England to intervene, to put the brakes on their own policy within less than a week of the policy being announced. So something has gone horribly wrong. Whatever the plan was, something's gone horribly wrong, even as they continue to deny it.
Like you said earlier on, mate, you can't argue with the markets, you can't argue with the numbers. Like, these are cold, hard facts that are coming out now. It can't be spun. There's still a few people I see out there on Twitter today, but this can't be spun. These are facts. You can't argue these, and it just remains to be seen what they do with Liz, what they do with Kwasi. I mean, I honestly, I'm speechless this morning. I don't even know why I tried. Just angry.
No, well, I mean, I think sometimes we can articulate feelings without necessarily having found the right words. But I think that's the first time anyone's ever said I'm speechless. I don't know why I've rung in. I think that's a real moment of beauty in the history of my presenting career. God, that's funny. I know exactly what you mean, though. Sometimes you sort of think you've got all your ducks in a row, and then your levels of anger reach such a degree that, I mean, I'll go to the travel news or something. or play a clip. People are defending it, not just on Twitter. Alistair Heath in the Daily Telegraph. Liz Truss must hold her nerve. Her economic plans are exactly right. Are exactly the right ones to grow a real economy. And you just sort of think, you know, at some point in that crowd, there were still 2 or 3 people shouting, I think you'll find the Emperor's clothes are rather wonderful and beautiful robes, and it's only because you're so stupid that you still can't see them. And that is the position adopted this morning by Alistair Heath in the Daily Telegraph, isn't it? There are a few people still in the crowd claiming that the Emperor is clad in beautiful clothes, Phil.
Yeah, well, they couldn't have come at a worse time. I think Keir Starmer had a strong performance this week. I just think they'll have to react, and oh, yeah.
I think they will.
Thanks for speaking to me today.
No, I'm listening more than speaking. I think they will have to act, but all of those examples you gave remind us that the model since Theresa May, the model under Johnson, was sit and wait until it goes away, until the next crisis comes along to blow the current crisis off the front pages. And I used to think that was simplistic or even perhaps a bit facile, but it really wasn't. It was just that list that Phil just did. He jotted it down. Off the top of my head, I could stick a couple of other things on it that he'd forgotten, all of which would have ended normal political careers. So what Johnson did, and this is quite an interesting thought, I think, what Johnson did is absolutely trash the concept of a resignation issue. We all used to have a relatively clear idea of what a resignation issue was, and Amber Rudd was probably the last example Priti Patel, of course, who was forced to resign. But he's killed the resignation issue, along with so much else. When I'm making a list, so you can tell things are bad when I start making a list. Making a list of all the people that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, all the people and/or institutions of all that Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are currently ignoring. So you've got the Bank of England, who had to act in order to put the brakes upon their policy catastrophe yesterday, although Liz Truss has already undone some of the repairs that were undertaken by insisting that they weren't necessary, or essentially by insisting that the thing that caused the need for repairs was the right thing to do. You've got the credit agencies, you've got the IMF, almost unprecedentedly, in fact possibly unprecedentedly for a G7 country, an IMF breaking glass to ring the alarm bell. Bank of England, IMF, credit agencies. You've got Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, yesterday as well. Yeah, and of course we had Danny Blanchflower on the government, on the programme, a former member of the Monetary Policy Committee. But they've also ignored the civil service. Chiefly, they fired Tom Scholar, the head civil servant in the Treasury, who I'm yet to see anyone have a bad word to say. So do feel free to add to this list. The Bank of England, the IMF, the credit agencies, the civil service, Mark Carney, Danny Blanchflower, so much individuals, although I think this individual, there is one individual, of course, who warned against this in the most strenuous of terms. And then on the other side of the list, you've got Nigel Farage, who said it was the best budget since 1986, and some bloke in the Telegraph, who, I just check because I'm silly like this, a bloke in the Telegraph who actually won the IEA's Free Enterprise Award previously and spoke at the IEA's 60th anniversary gala. So even when they don't actually work for the IEA, the so-called Institute of Economic Affairs, they are in bed with them. So this chap, Alistair Heath, who writes today, Liz Truss must hold her nerve as the world tips into a calamitous recession. He spoke at the IEA's 60th anniversary gala and is a previous winner of their Free Enterprise Award. Who sort of funds all these awards and all of these individuals, and most importantly, of course, all of these people who keep popping up, because the Daily Mail's got a full page today by someone who's the head of research at the Institute of Economic Affairs, because they obviously also struggle to find anybody whose funding is transparent who was prepared to defend this budget. But here we are, that's 6 minutes after 11. So we've got Nigel Farage and the secretly funded think tanks. A bloke in the Telegraph, and Chris Philp, who achieved the astonishing this morning when he proved to be marginally less effective than Chris Grayling at doing what used to be Chris Grayling's job of defending the indefensible. So we've got Nigel Farage, the secretly funded think tanks, a bloke in the Telegraph called Alistair Heath, and Chris Philp, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who has deleted his own tweet claiming that things were actually going very well. That's another brilliant example of just how bad everything is. So Kwarteng and Truss claim they can't talk about the currency markets. Kwarteng actually got collared by a journalist with a microphone. I can't talk about this, I can't. So they put out this line, it's a lie, that they can't talk about the currency markets, because while he was still delivering the speech in the House of Commons, the pound sort of burped. The pound enjoyed a tiny little boost, a tiny little rise, at which point Chris Philp was on Twitter faster than you could say, don't forget the character limit, to tweet about how good it was to see the pound responding positively to Kwasi Kwarteng's announcement. So if the Chief Secretary of the Treasury thought it was going to go up, that was the plan. So the claim today that seeing it hit the lowest level on record was the correct course of action is beyond a lie. We're in a whole new world of deception and disingenuousness, aren't we? Because the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and you can tell he's embarrassed by this because he's deleted it, and politicians very rarely delete tweets, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury has deleted the tweet that proved the plan was to see the pound go up, while the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer continue to insist that seeing the pound hit the lowest level it's ever reached was a consequence of doing the right thing. You can't have both. And they are the three whose fingerprints would be most commonly found on the entire ridiculous proposal. 8 minutes after 11 is the time. I'm going to add this bloke to the list, because Rishi Sunak, the last Chancellor of the Exchequer, is looking more and more like Mystic Meg.
So I think everyone's economy is different. But the number one challenge we face here, the number one challenge is inflation. You guys all see it, right? All your bills every week, every month, they're going up and up and up. The most pressing economic priority for the new Prime Minister and the new government is to grip inflation. We cannot make it worse. Inflation is the enemy that makes everybody poorer. It erodes your savings. It erodes your living standards. It means that those of you that have mortgages will see your interest rates go up higher and higher. So I don't think the responsible thing to do right now is launch into some unfunded spree of borrowing and more debt. That will just make inflation worse. It will make the problem longer.
Let's be clear. We have inflation because of our monetary policy, that we haven't been tough enough on the monetary supply. That's the way I would address that issue.
Okay.
But it is wrong.
Interest rates up. Mortgages nightmare.
It is.
Liz, we have to be honest. We have to be honest. But borrowing your way out of inflation isn't a plan. It's a fairy tale.
9 minutes after 11 is the time, and I've got one other person to add to the list of people who are prepared to defend Liz Truss. I haven't checked in with this guy yet, but I think we can be fairly clear that he too would join Nigel Farage, the secretly funded think tanks, a bloke in the Telegraph, and Chris Philp on claiming that what Liz Truss is doing is somehow the right idea. I don't know if you remember him. He popped up on the telly. I hadn't come across him before, just about 3 weeks ago.
Let's look at two different opinions in the papers this morning. You have a columnist, Matthew Syed, who's basically predicting that it's going to be a nightmare and that the leadership contest has been out of touch with the country. But Janet Daly in the Telegraph says, look, actually, Liz Truss is stronger than you think. If she gets cracking, gets out there, she might be able to...
Janet. I think, the haters will say that we've had 12 years of the Tories and that we're sort of at the dregs of what they've got available, and that Liz Truss is sort of like the backwash of the available MPs. I wouldn't say that because I'm incredibly right-wing, but some people might say that.
But the consensus, though, in politics is often wrong, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's often wrong, and we often don't know what is going to pan out.
Yeah. Well, as Liz said there, she said it would be wrong to predict the future, even though loads of people have predicted that we're going to have real issues with paying our energy bills. But, I think she's right to just sort of basically say, well, let's not predict and see what happens next week. I think she did the right thing there.
I said it at the time that Joe Lycett's satirical support for Liz Truss there was actually brilliant, not just because it was very funny, but because it actually blew the lid off what genuine support for her looks like. Utterly cultish, utterly delusional, and utterly wrong, as events have once again proved. And speaking of events proving things, having just double-checked whether the bloke in the Telegraph defending Liz Truss had any links with these secretly funded think tanks and finding out that he actually won an award and spoke at their 60th anniversary dinner, I've just discovered that Chris Philp published, and my thanks to everyone who sent me this, I've got the best listeners in the world, as I sometimes forget to remind you. Chris Philp actually published a pamphlet for the Taxpayers Alliance in 2013 calling for, I think, people in receipt of unemployment benefit to sort of go out and work in return for their benefits. I can't be bothered to read it, to be honest with you, but the title of it was Work for the Dole. New report calls for work for the dole. So another secretly funded so-called think tank there with Chris Philp, now Chief Secretary to the Treasury, on their website as a former contributor, a former author of reports. So that's it. It's Joe Lycett then. Joe Lycett, brackets, but he was taking the mickey, close brackets, is the final addition to the list of people defending Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. The list of those criticising them currently includes the Bank of England, the IMF, the credit agencies, the Civil Service, Mark Carney, Danny Blanchflower and Rishi Sunak, who I misdescribed a moment ago as the last Chancellor. How could anyone forget Nadeem Zahawi's tenure in that job? Honestly, it's going to be a pub quiz question that in years to come. But Nadeem Zahawi was a Chancellor for a few weeks, wasn't he, as well? 12 after 11 is the time. Jas is in Hitchin. Jas, what would you like to say?
James, I think you missed one person on that list that has told the government that they shouldn't do this, and that's clearly yourself. You're the only person. I'm not blowing or massaging your ego.
Nobody cares about what I have to say. But also, not on this, mate. I could have warned you about the direction of traffic, but I thought the giving me a ton of money last Friday as a high-rate taxpayer was disgusting and ridiculous, but I didn't foresee what happened subsequently to the pound. So on this one occasion, I'm going to reject politely your I told you so invitation, Jas, but thank you.
No, but you're the only person that's talked common sense in the last 6 years, in my humble opinion.
Very
anyway,
kind. Thank you.
I'm also got fairly broad shoulders with the job that I do, and I also, I was a bit taken back when I saw and heard what was being done last week, and I've always felt that people like ourselves should share the burden a lot more. You asked one of your callers earlier, what's the analogy? What were they thinking? you know, the only thing I can come up with, James, is that, you know, it's just like Putin, when he was going into Ukraine, he thought he'd be welcomed with open arms. There'll be flag bearers, and, you know, the Ukrainians would say, yeah, we want Russia, blah, blah, blah. And we know that's the last thing that's happened. And likewise,
and if not that, then they would crush the opposition so quickly that the whole adventure would be done and dusted by the end of the first weekend. I mean, I think that's a matter of record.
Zelensky was, you know, they were hoping Zelensky would leave the country, and the country would collapse. And, you know, he stood his ground, rightly so. And here now, they were expecting the markets to welcome it with open arms, and, you know, and the institutions to say, yeah, this is really good. The economy is definitely going to grow. And again, that's the last thing that's happened. And, you know, Labour, you know, love them or hate them, you know, whatever you want to think of it, but their idea of taxing the energy companies for this funding of freezing the bills was a really good one. And even if the Tories had said, right, okay, you know what, we're going to compromise. We're going to tax half of this through the energy windfall. The markets may have swallowed it, but they're just so arrogant, and they just believe that, you know, this trickle-down economy is going to work. But, you know, those days are far, far gone, and, you know, it needs to have a radical change. And I'm sadly to say that these lot are not those people.
It is. I mean, it's my job to do this, so I can't dwell too long on it. But the mystery is real, isn't it? Because the analysis, if you were doing it on Friday, even while Chris Filt was tweeting about how brilliant it was all going because the pound was going up, cannot exist in the same logical universe as the claim today in the wake of the collapse that we've seen. It cannot exist in the same logical universe as the claim that this is the correct thing to do. Because if it was the correct thing to do, none of the stuff that has happened would have happened. And they just almost seem to be... glossing over is too weak a term to describe it.
You're right. The thing is, with Chris Phelps tweeting that the pound is always going to do really well, blah blah blah. Yeah. It just shows that was what they were using as a means of saying this is successful.
Yes, exactly.
So instead of saying, you know what, we've got it wrong, they're doubling down, as this government has done in the last 6-7 years, whether it was Partygate, Brexit, you know, all the other shenanigans that have gone on. They double down and just, you know what, honesty just simply doesn't exist with these lot. It simply doesn't, and therefore, you know, instead of all they're doing is protecting their egos as opposed to protecting the poor and those who are struggling with the current crisis.
I think that the ego is definitely part of it. In the Freudian sense, it's their sense of self that's under attack, or it's a fear of shame and humiliation that prompts them to double down on what is clearly an epic error. Jas, thank you. That's a great call. Quick text here. You can add the National Trust, the RSPB and the Wildlife Trust to those opposing Truss's plans because of the threats to environmental and wildlife protections. It's unsigned, that text, but, you know, I'm going to tell you something. You may or may not be aware of this, and you may think that I'm obsessed with these secretly funded lobby groups masquerading as think tanks. But the National Trust, like this weird group set up to attack the National Trust, the one that sort of is called Restore Trust. They hate the idea of too much history being displayed in National Trust properties because it provides a little bit too much information about perhaps where the money came from originally to build that house, which will almost always involve sugar plantations and slavery. So there's an outfit called Restore National Trust, which is claiming to represent thousands of ordinary members. It's funded by donations, but says it's under no legal or moral obligation to publish its accounts. Does that sound familiar? Because you automatically start wondering, oh, well, if it's not publishing its accounts, how do we know where these donations are coming from to fund it? And guess who the founding director or a founding director of Restore National Trust is? Go on, have a guess. I'll tell you after this. I know what you're thinking. You say, I bet he forgets. I bet he forgets to tell us who it is that actually is behind this strange outfit called Restore National Trust that claims it's funded by thousands of donations and ordinary members, but refuses to publish its accounts. It was one of the founders, one of the founding directors, was the chairman of the Institute of Economic Affairs, a chap called Neil Record. Director of RT 2021 Limited, which is the trading name of Restore Trust, a private company that exists to attack the National Trust. Oh, come on. Tinfoil hat in the bin, I think, now, don't you? 21 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Should we summon the Usherwood, see if our esteemed colleagues in BBC local stations have turned up any more nuggets? I think we should. Summon the Usherwood. It is 22 minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Bank of England, IMF, credit agencies, civil service, Mark Carney, Danny Blanchflower, Rishi Sunak on one side, attacking and criticising Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's budget from last week, and on the side of praising it, you got Nigel Farage. You did have the front page of the Daily Mail, but they're not even reporting on this mess until page 8 today. They're too busy telling you about one of Stephen Lawrence's murderers being found to have a telephone hidden up his bottom in jail. Think tanks, bloke in the Telegraph, Chris Philp, who used to write reports for these think tanks, and of course Joe Lycett, although he was joking. John's in Tottenham. John, what's going on?
Morning, James. I'm gonna have a crack at the mental gymnastics required to try and figure out what they thought they were doing.
Go on then.
I think they thought that coming in...
Do you want me to hold your ankles? What sort of gymnastics are you doing? Is it... Shall I...
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a cartwheel going into an Arab Spring.
Carry on.
I think that they thought that coming in hard and strong straight away with their ideology was going to remind everyone that they're pro-deregulation, pro-small government, pro-low taxes. I think they thought that promising to roll back the planned rise in corporation tax was going to reassure big business and corporations, that putting money in the pockets of rich people was going to remind people that they're all about the individual rising up. And then the markets responded the way they did. And now all we're dealing with is ego. Now we're just dealing with people who cannot acknowledge that they've made a mistake. They are sat in a room, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are sat in a room repeatedly showing each other that page from the book about leadership, which says you don't back down, you don't waver, that if you're going to be a strong leader, you don't change your mind. And they keep quoting it to each other. That quote goes something along the lines of, think outside the box and they'll call you crazy, stick to your guns and they'll realise you're a genius. And that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with individuals who are so wedded to their ideologies that when they're presented with fundamental, obvious facts that they're not working, all that they can do is go, you're crazy, you don't know how clever I am, you do not know how clever I am, hold tight. And then they can't even acknowledge talking about it, because if they talk about it, the thread gets pulled and they realise everything that holds them up and supports all their ideas and all their stupid ideologies will just fall to pieces, because it doesn't work. It clearly doesn't work. It's not just about whether you think this is working or what your political, whether you're left wing or right wing. The fact is, the optics matter. People feel scared. Markets feel scared. Everyone's buggered. Excuse my French. No one has any money. Everyone's worried about their mortgages going up. The energy prices, they talk about reducing the energy price. No, we weren't there yet. People are still paying more than they were ever going to pay. We're still paying more than people are paying in France and in Germany. And they cannot acknowledge that their decisions are messing it up for people, because they're so bunkered down in a room together, just reminding each other how much of a genius they are. Yeah. And when you're dealing with that, when you got to that point, there's nothing we can do, because you can't. People will not readjust their egos in front of us.
And every time they speak, they get it worse. That's at the heart of your analysis. It's a thing of beauty, John, mate.
Yeah,
it's not normal to do this, because Mystery Hour doesn't start until 12 o'clock, but this is the least I can do in response to what, for my money, is the best analysis I've heard all week, including, for the record, my own.
Okay.
That was absolutely bang on. Well, because you've knitted it all together, haven't you? You've knitted together the personal and the political, and it's impossible to separate them, because that refusal to double down and that image of them sort of being the only people left who think that they're both brilliant, telling each other that this is great, until, of course, Truss throws him under a bus, or tries to, because I can't really see it unfolding in any other way. But
they're so entwined with each other, and this is the danger. Obviously, she can get rid of him in a way that he can't get rid of her, but she's not going to get rid of him in order to take a different course. No. She's not able to do that. We're not watching someone who has a high emotional intelligence that can take on information and readjust their view on things. Yeah. We're not. We're looking at someone who believes they're on a mission to, I don't know what they're on a mission to be, a memorable leader. And maybe the only way you can be memorable is by making everyone poorer and just being a footnote in the history of the worst period of economic crisis.
And that's the best case scenario, mate. That's the best case scenario of what happens next.
That's all we can hope, yeah. That's all we can hope.
And that idea about coming in with all guns blazing and thinking you can only have achieved that level of hubris, because, make no mistake, what you describe is hubris, with the backdrop that you've just detailed. You can only be there if you're high on your own supply, if you're Kool-Aided up to the eyeballs. I know what we'll do. I know what we'll do, Liz.
It's computer game stuff, isn't it? It's like, I don't know whether you ever used to play Theme Park or Theme Hospital.
Yes.
You got a little bit of money and you're like, oh, should I build another ride? You build another ride, you run out of money, and then you've got no one, and you're like, oh, shit.
Sugar. Yeah, all right, enough now. I'm just worried about your language, but that round of applause was very, very, very happily given, John. I'm actually slightly envious of your ability to articulate and knit together all of those elements, because that's the first proper account of what on earth they thought they were playing at on Friday that I can buy into. That's why we don't need to hear from the OBR. We don't need to hear from Tom Scholar. We don't need to hear from the civil service. I don't care what the Bank of England thinks. The IMF can take a running jump. We believe that this is going to work. I believe that this is going to work. And that is what pushed them into, epically hubristic territory, if you like your theories of tragedy to have an Aristotelian flavour. Theo Usherwood is here. Should we squeeze it in before the news, or should we kick off with it after the past?
Your decision, James. It's your show.
Well, I want you to have a proper amount of space, which means I'm going to have to squeeze Sean in Mill Hill into the remaining part of this section. Sean, what would you like to say?
Just a quick one.
Yes, good.
First of all, the thing is that, James,
yes,
if you got Crimea and you got away with it, now you're starting thinking, what else can I take? It's exactly the same. There's no plan, there's nothing. They thought they'll get away with it because they got away with Brexit. Because the list it's a never-ending list.
Yes.
I can repeat, they got away with it.
They got away with it.
Is what it's simple. Not overthinking, not overcomplicated.
Go on.
They thought they'll get away with it.
You might, but I think, they're inextricably intertwined, and there would be no financial crisis this week without Brexit, and that's a given. And they are identical in some ways, and the people cheering them along are exactly the same people, although some of the maddest Brexiters have actually stayed very silent about the latest excitements, including in the Conservative Party. But Brexit, I don't know if the criticism I was about to bring to the table would work because of what John just told us in Tottenham a moment ago, because it is an ideological commitment to something that is crackers. And the last time we were ideologically committed to the thing that all those pesky experts said was crackers, we won. We won an actual referendum, so it can't be crackers at all because we won the referendum, get over it. But it was crackers, and it's still crackers, and it will always be crackers, because they're crackers.
And exactly. You're absolutely right.
No, you're absolutely right.
They're going to come back and say, well, James, we did this because we wanted you to cry. We enjoy you crying.
We haven't got to that stage. We got there on Friday. There's a ridiculous woman. Theo will know her name. She's the head of the Conservatives on the Greater London Assembly.
Susan Hall?
Susan Hall tweeted something along the lines of, I don't understand any of this, but James O'Brien is upset, so it must be good. So actually Sean is not, and that's not just some random troll on Twitter. Well, I suppose it is a random troll on Twitter, who is also the leader of the Conservatives on the Greater London Assembly. But you think he's exaggerating. Oh, I love it because it's made James O'Brien cry. The leader of the Conservative group on the Greater London Assembly actually tweeted that. I wonder if she's still loving it. Well, Theo Usherwood is here.
Because Number 10 is still sticking to their line that they have the right plan in place. They're not budging from it at the moment after that hour-long, 8 successive interviews, 5 minutes each, with local radio stations the length and breadth of England. One that you missed off, my fault probably for not providing it, James, was BBC Radio Nottingham.
What are you blaming yourself for? It's ridiculous. You're one of the hardest working men in the building.
It's going to benefit far greater those who are very, very well off. If you make $1 million, you're going to benefit 55 grand a year from the tax cuts. On 20k, like a teaching assistant or a nurse, £157. A couple of people have said to me here in Nottingham, this is like a reverse Robin Hood.
That simply isn't true.
Which
by
bit of
far
it?
the biggest part
Which
of
bit
the
of
mini.
it?
Well,
that the tax cuts are disproportionately benefiting the wealthiest.
The biggest part of the package that we announced is the support on energy bills.
It was Sarah Julian, the presenter, asking the question.
This is unsustainable. I know you're not allowed to express opinions, but it's as if every time she opens her mouth, everything gets worse. So you say what you like about Boris Johnson, who was morally much more corrupt than Liz Truss, and politically, I guess, much more dangerous. But at least he could talk his way out of trouble. I don't mean that as a compliment. I think it was a disaster, just two disasters of very different flavour. But every time she opens her mouth, the situation gets worse, not better. And these people have done some brilliant journalists. Sheila Fogarty pointing out how ridiculous, patronising, even perhaps condescending it is to be surprised by the quality of the reporting that has come from the regions today, or indeed of thinking that they wouldn't be able to interview a Prime Minister during a crisis. They do every day what we do every day, just on a slightly different shaped pitch.
Yes, and they don't necessarily have to go back, James. So they've got
access. They don't need.
This is a really special moment for each of those presenters, and they just used it.
So there's a tension for a certain type of presenter at the moment, in that you need to keep access to these people, but if you're of a certain age, then now it looks like your pensions might be under threat. So you might even find it within yourself to get quite angry with representatives of the government, even though you're worried about losing your invitations to all their parties and keeping access for your guest roster on your programme, because your pension, which is probably even more important than your position of influence with the Conservative Party, your pension is under threat now. So I'm going, do you know what, I might go in quite hard on a Tory today for the first time ever.
But also, and local radio is very competitive, and I worked in local journalism for a long time. They're trying to better each other, so it just got worse and worse and worse as they were trying to come up with pithier comments as it went on. So then you ended up on Radio Bristol towards the end of the hour. You played part of this excerpt, but I just made it a little bit longer for you, James.
I mean, it's hard to know what has fallen more since you entered Downing Street, the value of the pound or the Tory poll rating. But on a serious note, no one can deny you entered Downing Street with a difficult job on your hands, but you've made the situation worse so far, haven't you?
Well, let's remember the situation we were facing when I entered Downing Street was that people were facing bills of up to £6,000 this winter for their energy. We were facing very high inflation and an economic slowdown. And I and the Chancellor have taken decisive action to deal with that. From this weekend, the energy bill price guarantee comes in, so people will be facing no more than £2,500 for a typical energy bill. We've also taken action to reduce our tax burden and spur
but Prime Minister, with respect, that is the same scripted answer you've given to every BBC local radio station this morning. You've got the Bank of England stepping in now to try and clean up a mess a government has caused. That has never happened.
Dan Snow, the history guy, a brilliant bloke in lots of ways, tweeted, "That was the worst provincial campaign of any of our leaders since autumn of 1216, when King John marched about dealing with a rebellion and 2 invasions, caught dysentery in Norfolk, lost the crown jewels in the wash and died in Nottinghamshire." There it is. That was James Hansen on BBC Bristol playing an absolute blinder.
But there's nowhere for the Prime Minister to go on this. No. So she can't admit fault, because if she admits fault, then that only instills a feeling, more panic within the financial markets. If the government is...
Are you sure about that?
Well, if she says we made a mistake...
some of these policies,
but she can't reverse the policies because she can't get away with it politically.
No, but I'm just questioning, let's pick it one at a time. The financial markets would respond positively to a U-turn. They categorically would, but the party would never.
I'm talking about two different things.
So am I.
So I'm saying, can she admit she made a mistake? Can she say we got it wrong? I'm not. If you have a government that has implemented a policy and then goes back on the policy by saying you made a mistake, I don't know. There would be a question mark about saying, well, over in the financial markets about whether she's competent enough. Then you move on to stage 2. Is actually, can you reverse the mistake?
Yes.
How does she reverse? We're only 2 weeks into this premiership.
But I'm going to disagree with you on this. I think that her party. I mean, it might do for her premiership.
Yeah.
But the party would welcome a U-turn on this.
A caucus of the party would welcome a U-turn.
And so would the markets.
If the U-turn went ahead.
Yes.
But politically, how can she have any credibility to go back to the backbenches?
Well, she hasn't got any credibility now. So if I was advising her, I'd say, how can it possibly get worse? Do the U-turn, own it. Say, unlike other politicians, when things go wrong, I will take responsibility for it and I will admit the mistake. I've been reading How Not to Be Wrong by James O'Brien, and the first line is, there's no point having a mind if you never change it, and I have changed my mind.
But the particular policy that is believed to be underscored the panic in the markets was the inflationary one, which was the abolition of the abolition of the 45p rate of tax, which kicks in at £150,000.
Yes,
that underpins the whole project.
That's only £2 billion. It's the cuts. No,
but it's the whole project that you create wealth, that you're making the UK more attractive for foreign investors to come and base themselves here and create jobs. The whole thing is underpinned by that and the lifting of the banker's bonus cap.
Yes.
And you can't... That's
so in other words, if they undertake a U-turn, what do they stand for, is what you're saying?
You have to go back to
what did Boris Johnson stand
policy.
for? What did Boris Johnson stand for?
Well, let's go back to what Rishi Sunak stood for when he was in the Treasury, and that was fiscal prudence, sound money, the idea that you actually we had a huge deficit after the pandemic, that we were going to have to bring in measures to support people through the energy crisis, and that you couldn't borrow against the back of that to pay for it. Because as Rishi Sunak said in the final LBC hustings, James, that the markets need to have confidence that you can pay back the money that you're borrowing. And if they don't have confidence, then interest rates shoot up.
So he was right about every single element of this.
Yes,
as things stand.
You're going by the
then you
market's
keep
reaction,
saying she can't undo it. Then what happens next? I mean, what is she doing?
She's just got to ride it out.
But how long will that take? What does that even look like? Markets don't sit there. Markets are alive. They're like organisms. They're not just they don't have a shelf life. They're not like stars that are burning out in the sky. They every day is a new day.
So if you're looking at what's happening in the markets today, and I'm following, there's a guy called Andy Bruce from Reuters. He's very good. He's really good follow if you follow him, and David Milliken, I think, at Reuters as well. If you look at what they're saying, they're starting to see the markets smooth out. Things starting to get not back to normal by any stretch, but they're steadying a bit.
They accommodate the new status quo, which is considerably worse than the previous status quo, but they still have to have some semblance of stability for the most obvious.
And then you get to the medium term, and then you get to the medium term for fiscal statement on November the 23rd. Yeah. And whereas Kwasi Kwarteng on Sunday was suggesting that we could see further tax cuts within what was actually going to be a budget to start off with in November, you're not going to necessarily see those tax cuts implemented in November.
Spending cuts, though, they have to find this money from somewhere.
Yes, I mean they're making
spending cuts. I mean, have a look around. Where are you going to find cuts now?
But that's what they're told to find things. When we were talking last Friday, we went down to the last paragraph of the Taxpayers Alliance, welcoming the mini budget, and they were saying actually we want to see this paid for by spending cuts rather than more borrowing.
Because the country is currently providing far too much care and comfort for people who aren't super rich. I've got some support here. Stephen in Milton Keynes says, for the first time ever, I want to challenge Theo.
Oh, no.
He said, a new precedent has been set by Johnson. I sometimes think you're so close to the action, you might... The precedent is that Truss can say she got it wrong and everyone will just move on.
No, but Boris Johnson never said he got it wrong.
No, I know. A new precedent has been set by Johnson in that you know none of the old rules apply. None of the old rules apply. And so saying I made a terrible mistake, I'm so sorry, I'm going to fix it, it would actually wash now in this sort of post-truth era, post-consequence era.
But it's problematic.
I don't think
she politically, I'm not sure she can.
And what is the state of the Tory party at the moment? It's Mystery Hour at 12. It's like every hour.
So she's got a year. She's got a year.
But what's going on in the Tory party? I mean, can you put a number on how many people are actually livid? There was a brilliant quote from one off-the-record MP who was listening to Kwasi Kwarteng's Ring Around and asked what they thought of it, and they replied, I'm not really listening. I'm trying to plan my new career and sort out my mortgage.
So for starters, and you played the excerpt from the interviews with on BBC Radio Lancashire about fracking. You've got the Red Wall Tories who are absolutely petrified they're going to be out of a job because they're finding it increasingly difficult to see how they remain as an MP after the next election. You've got the Rishi Sunak supporters, including Rishi Sunak, who of course is a Rishi Sunak supporter, who just aren't going to the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. As one of Rishi Sunak's supporters said, an ally said, we're just going to let Liz Truss own the moment in Birmingham next week. So we're also talking about people like Mel Stride, who's the chairman of the Treasury Select Committee.
Are you going?
Sorry?
Are you going?
Yes, I'm planning to.
Are you looking forward to it?
I mean, it's going to be a bloodbath, but yeah.
Sure, I'm quite tempted.
You better get your pass in.
I can stay at my mum's.
But you need a pass to get in.
I'll borrow yours.
We don't look anything alike.
You should be so lucky. I told management yesterday I was thinking of going, and I had that look on their face thinking, I hope he's joking. on this one.
Yeah, well, we can only imagine.
I don't need to go into the hall. I just stand outside like Femi used to do with a little table saying, convince me that this is a good idea or something like that.
Well, I don't think
or
people...
I could do Vox Pops.
I
could do Vox Pops like Jordan Klepper does at Trump rallies.
I don't think the people that you would want to Vox Pop are necessarily even going to be in the West Midlands.
No.
Unless their constituencies are in the West
I
Midlands.
get to see my mum.
So they're not going... They're going to be staying away. And then you've got
Kiddie
the
are away on Saturday, so I'd pop up if Kiddie were playing at home. I don't know, we'll see.
What's more worrying, though, is that you're starting to see people who back Liz Truss going, oh, we made a mistake.
Yeah, this is where it starts to get...
A little bit like they did with Jeremy Corbyn. Oh, my God.
And, of course, no matter what Andy Bruce is reporting at Reuters, there are other sectors as well. More than 300 more residential mortgage products have been withdrawn from the market in the last 24 hours. That means 321 in total. In the last 24 hours, that means a total of 40% of all mortgage products have been taken off the market since the Chancellor's mini-budget on Friday, which was explicitly designed to increase movement in the housing market. The stamp duty cuts, will make more transactions. You know, this is not an opinion, this is counting. And 40% of the products have now been taken. That's 1,000. Guess how many that is in 6 days?
More than 1,000.
Yeah, carry on.
1,500?
More, higher.
1,800.
1,621 mortgage products have been withdrawn, leaving just 2,340 on sale.
But the stamp duty cut was to do...
No, I know they're different things, but it was designed to stimulate movement in the housing market.
The housing market. And of course, if lenders aren't lending to people to have mortgages, then solicitors aren't getting the transactions through, then surveyors aren't doing the surveys they need to do. It's a whole industry, and that will obviously have a huge knock-on effect if people just can't get the money in order to buy properties. And they're obviously, and the reason they're pulling the products off the market is because they're expecting rates to go up even higher, and for those products that they are offering at the lower rates to be unviable.
Yeah. Any good news for us?
Not today.
A rather perfect distillation of my slightly warped desire to attend the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham this weekend, summed up by the comedian Suze Kempner, who's tweeted this morning. Yesterday afternoon, in fact. Liz Truss is going to be the first Prime Minister who is removed from office with an offstage shepherd's crook during party conference. I'll tell you what, if she comes in dancing like Theresa May did that time, I'll give you the money myself. Barry's in Aberdeen. Barry, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, James, good morning. A compelling urge just to dial in and share a little bit of my experience, to be honest.
Carry on.
I've just landed back in the UK and Scotland 3 months ago after being away for 19 years working overseas in 3 pretty impressive countries that, politically, they've not been without their challenges, but what a show this has been for all the wrong reasons to arrive into. And, overall, it's so depressing and disappointing to see this in the scale that it's going through.
How do you make sense of it, having had a sort of almost an outsider's perspective for so long? How do you make sense of it? You might have more clarity than us because our screens are pressed up, our faces are pressed up to the screen. Yours hasn't been necessarily.
Yeah, there's so many things on the menu to discuss, but if you just try and summarise it holistically, you get up out of bed every day and shake your head. We've moved back as a family. We made a decision to come back to be closer to family.
Sure.
An interesting one is my son's 3, and we've got childcare cost issues, which a number of people are facing. My wife is due a baby any minute, and our experience, because we were back in the system of public or private health insurance, we obviously don't. We have to wait out the waiting period, and we've had direct experience the likes of the NHS. And I was embarrassed. I was really, really embarrassed to take my partner, my wife, into the conditions that the hospitals are facing. I mean, run down rooms that are falling apart.
Yes.
It's not really around the NHS. It's just everything,
and the idea that the only way they can begin to fill in some of the holes that they've blown in the economy over the last week is by bringing in more spending cuts becomes doubly terrifying against that concept. I don't want to spook you, but there was a story in the paper today about a first-time mother who drove an hour to a hospital to give birth because 4 maternity units turned her away. And she's a nurse, so, she'd know the system inside out, wouldn't she?
it's down to the detail as well. You know, we had the fortune of living in Singapore and Australia and then latterly Dubai just before we left, and it's not so much to draw a comparison, but you can't help it. The antiquated ways and systems of even simple things like measuring your blood pressure, it's all done manually. The state of the rooms, but also, you know, as I say, holistically, we've come back. We took a fairly, you know, decent job. I think I'm slightly embarrassed about the tax cuts because, you know, I'm in a bracket where that, you know, yes, we can make ends meet.
And they've given you more money. They're letting you keep more money.
I mean, you know, then I'm looking at my parents who are retired, who's just had, I think my stepfather's just had 10 grand wiped off his pension over the last few weeks and months. People who really need it, the party, ultimately the Tories just don't seem to get it. And, you know, on top of all of that, we were looking at buying a house, we had a set budget, and now we're looking at interest rates blowing themselves out the water, which just scuppers the plans. So,
Lord,
you know,
if you can get a mortgage.
Well, that's the other issue. You're 3 months back into the country and honestly scratching your head. And I'm not an overly political guy, but I can assure you that there'll be no tick in the box for the Tory party the next time, next general election that comes round. Because change has to happen, you know?
Yeah, a couple of people pointing out that healthcare is devolved in Scotland, of course, so you're not necessarily describing something that is the responsibility of Westminster, but in terms of a general malaise and of course of the source of overall funding, it's a strange one. You know, I'm going to ask you this. I apologise in advance. Do you think you made a mistake coming back?
I'm going to give it some time.
All right.
But, you know, we were fortunate to have Australian citizenship, and let's be honest, I'm sure your educated and well-versed viewers or listeners will know that, you know, we had half a dozen prime ministers over almost as many years, but the economy never really suffered to the point, and there are external factors for that. But yeah, I mean, 100%. I have a citizenship and I have a passport, and I'm seriously thinking about it.
You have an escape route. You have an escape route, which of course the same people responsible for the financial crisis took away from a lot of the rest of us, albeit that wouldn't have included Australia and citizenship, but it would have included freedom of movement and the entire European Union, and indeed more than the entire European Union, because it would also apply to some of the sort of satellite members as well, wouldn't it? Barry, we'll talk again, I sense. I apologise. I almost feel guilty now. You know, imagine if this is News Source and it's all misery. Even Theo Usherwood today. The Tigger of radio journalism, the most cheerful and upbeat man you could ever hope to meet, answering my question about whether there was any good news today with the simple answer, no, not today. Mystery Hour's on the way. That's what he should have said. Actually, no, it worked better as comedy, didn't it? But he should have said, yes, Mystery Hour is on the way at 12 noon in about 3 or 4 minutes' time. Dave's in Ruislip. Might be the last word, this, Dave. Hello, mate. What do you want to say?
Yeah, first-time caller, so hopefully I hit the ground. I just want to
carry on.
I had to slip it in.
Very nice.
I just want to preface this by saying I've got a very good relationship with my father, and he is someone that confuses me politically, because he's been a postman for nearly 35 years, and before that he was a joiner. Right? Yeah. Very working class. Well, his roots aren't working class. He went to private school and all that, but he's someone that's always voted Tory. And he's, you know, it feels like he's voting against himself every single time. But he's invested a lot of energy and a lot of money into private pensions.
Okay.
And all that. And I've, you know, over the years I've tried to sort of wear him down. And I can probably say that on the economics, he's not very conservative. Right? Because he's a strong union man and all that. It doesn't make any sense.
No. Well, we're all a morass of conflicts and contradictions, aren't we?
Yeah. But he gets very much caught up in the wokey pokey as it is.
Right.
And I find anyone that uses the word woke in an argument from that side to immediately be disingenuous and someone almost not worth engaging with.
But they've lost the argument. They've lost the argument already if they use the word woke.
You know, I don't want to use the word idiot, but I would assume I can make assumptions, right?
Yes.
Now, he didn't even know all this stuff was going, you know, the pound's falling. Well, you know, every currency's falling. Yeah, but Dad, you know, the EU, you know, shoulder to shoulder. Yeah, Germany's not doing as good as it was, but it's not as bad as we are. Oh, they'll fall. You know, give it a few years.
well, you've been saying that for a while, okay, you know, and I'm still waiting, and I'd much rather be there than here.
Quite Brexity then.
So, yeah, very Brexity.
Yeah, because that's the social media. I think I see this. I keep an eye on it sometimes, just for work purposes. That there's this weird narratives coming out of.
Yeah.
The hashtag scum media, the idea that these financial crises have been caused by journalists or by reporting, and that we're all deliberately not reporting on we don't live in the Eurozone. The reason we're talking about the pound is because we bloody live in Britain, but that's the kind of stuff he's swallowing. That's
and this confuses me further, because he lives, like, I buy Private Eye. I started buying that very recently. Actually, it was during COVID I started listening to your show and got more politically engaged.
Private Eye is the perfect organ.
It's the creme de la creme.
Isn't
and
it?
he'll sit and read that and agree with everything in it. And then he'll go on the internet and watch his YouTube videos from GB News or Mayar Towsey. Oh, God, that's a name. I shudder to even mention.
I don't know who that is, but don't say anything libelous.
Yeah, I wouldn't. But
and then he comes back and it's undone all of the stuff that the sort of evidence-based or the fact-based journalism of Private Eye has delivered for him.
Exactly, because the way they like sort of like put their arguments to you, it's Britons are facing the hardest times. Forget who's in power, and it's the immigrants coming over and taking our jobs, and look, there's Sharia law in London, and
they're woke. And they're woke. I don't know what it means, but I know I'm scared of it because they've told me to be scared of it. And
I've tried to tie him down to his definition, and he can't do it.
Going to ring me. I've crashed the news. I'm going to crack on. Is that? I mean, I feel for you. That's tough. And
it's frustrating, but I think he's getting there.
Do you?
Because
that's good.
The economics have gone now.
That's going to hit his pension potentially. I mean, I think a lot of people are going to have felt, if they've understood what happened yesterday, and that of course would involve being plugged into some news sources that are not in the business of tugging forelocks and doffing caps. Then, if you're wondering why people who are normally prostrating them on the ground in front of any Conservative politician are showing a little bit of impatience, it will be because their pensions are now under threat. Dave, we'll talk again. Thank you, mate. Thank you for the kind words.
No more heroes anymore. No